reply. Please always fill in a borrowing slip, which is over there, and there's a reading room upstairs. On no account, under pain of death and excommunication, are you allowed to take books outside this building. So they have to be consulted in this building, but it is a very interesting collection. We have a great topic today, the new politics of Poland. Poland is, of course, this remarkable country, which in the last 50 years led the way in the emancipation from communism, the end of communism in Central Europe, democratization, then an attempted de-democratization after 2015 under the Law and Justice governments, following the Hungarian example, and now, since last autumn, attempted re-democratization. So it's a remarkable story which has much wider relevance than just for Poland. And we're delighted to have with us Professor Jarosław Kuisz, well known to us here. He was the co-director of our own Knowledge Bridges Britain, Poland, Europe project for many years. He's the CEO and editor-in-chief of Kultura Liberalna, one of the most interesting intellectual media and online magazines in Poland. Also a policy fellow at the Center for Science and Policy at Cambridge, a senior fellow at the Centrum Liberalna Moderna in Berlin, and assistant professor in the University of Warsaw, and a chercheur associé at the Institut d'Histoire du Temps Présent in Paris. So where are you not? But most importantly, he's the author of this book, The New Politics of Poland, and this book, if you read a German, Post-Traumatische Souveränität, on exactly the topic he's going to talk about. We're also very glad to have with us our own Gateva, lecturer in IR here in the DPIR, who is a specialist on post-communist politics in Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, and in particular has worked on issues around EU enlargement and the relationship of EU enlargement to the politics of member states, particularly in that part of Europe. And also is convener of a very interesting research network, which I commend to all of you, called Rethinking Europe's East-West Divide. We had the launch event here a few months ago. So we've got two great speakers. We've had lots of time. Without more ado, Jarek.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Indeed, I feel at home here. We had this wonderful experience of having the Knowledge Bridges program, and thank you, the Garton, for inviting me for this seminar and having an opportunity to share with you some ideas from the book. Indeed, this is the point of departure, the new politics of Poland, the book on Poland, but the book on the German one, if you read German, is on Eastern Europe. In fact, it was a springboard. This book was a springboard to write this book after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So it was a concept that was used to explain a phenomenon of unexpected solidarity among the countries that not necessarily were prone to cooperate, from Finland to Romania. Here I'm closing these introductory remarks, and I'm moving to our seminar. I have 30 minutes.
Very, very bad.
So I will start with the concept of post-traumatic sovereignty that I would like to highlight and underline during our meeting, and then I will try to tell you a few words about how to unwind an illiberal democracy in Poland, which is a fascinating topic as well. So I'm starting with sovereignty. At the beginning of the 21st century, the concept of sovereignty has returned to the limelight, and in recent years, not only in European countries, one has heard much about the demand for the return of territorial sovereignty, but also about, we have heard about the industrial sovereignty, about cyber sovereignty, and last but not least, sanitary sovereignty. So we are experiencing the fact that the concept of sovereignty is used on and on in so many contexts that it's interesting to highlight it. Obviously, for the European Union project, the main debate that is polarized between those who would like to have a more the more Europe project. On the other hand, we have the champions of Europe of Nations project. It's the dividing line that is based on an assumption that we know what the sovereignty means. And this is an important political distinction because it influences integration and disintegration of the European Union. But the point is that it is roughly based on the belief that everyone understands sovereignty in the same way. Nothing could be more positive. Nothing could be more positive. Sovereignty belongs to the catalog of highly controversial notions. And only in recent years it is said that academics proved its absolute usefulness, and at the same time even the harmfulness of the notion of sovereignty studied. So we have a whole spectrum of sovereignty intellectual understandings. And of course, the notion itself is not new. We are going back to Niccolo Machiavelli, to Jean Baudin, and obviously Thomas Hobbes when we are talking about the beginnings of the sovereignty. And by the way, it is interesting to see that what we could already say is that when the discussion of sovereignty starts, it means that there is a moment, possibly a moment of political turmoil. Because all this, the concept of sovereignty, when it was created by political philosophers, starting with Machiavelli and Jean Baudin, this was created at the moments of political turmoil, and we only see it when we realize that exactly that's the same time, the 16th century, in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there is virtually no such debate. Because I mean, it's a very interesting phenomenon. So we have a whole spectrum of sovereignty's intellectual understandings, and all in all, I believe that it seems to me that the scientific world seems rather inclined to leave the term in the vocabulary of academic terms, sometimes by a price of presenting an ascetic definition. So usually it is reduced to this simple phrase, a supreme authority within a territory. That's a classical, very classical definition of sovereignty. But for our considerations on Eastern European and in particular on Polish attitude towards sovereignty, this is not enough. What is interesting is the attitude for me is the attitude of people towards sovereignty. And therefore, a more interdisciplinary approach is needed. That's so. It usually goes with more capacious definitions. And then, what is also relevant is the history of political and legal culture, which means that how the sovereignty was experienced in the past by a certain nation, people, etc. So why we should talk about it in the 21st century? Because it may seem that it's a bit outdated. The point is that, especially in Eastern Europe, that we should say at the very, perhaps we could be tempted to say that, well, that's the topic that should belong to the past. And that should be, that's something that is absolutely to be dismissed when we are examining Polish politics and Polish current politics. What we have in Poland after 1989, in a nutshell, is this phenomenon that we have an independent state, definitely, but what we have also, we have the trauma of not having it. We have an independent state and the trauma of not having it. And this second part is as important as the first one. According to many data, the overwhelming majority of citizens tend to believe that the country's sovereignty is threatened in this way or another. We have a lot of statements by politicians, militaries, other public figures that sovereignty is in danger, and virtually those statements are hard to count, especially after the February 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Of course, and here I'm referring to Timothy Garton-Ash essays, we know that there is this existential angst, and it is very much present in Eastern and Central Europe. We have works by Istvan Bibo, we have works by Milan Kundera, about the contingency of small and medium-sized nations. What is more, the Shoah, the Holocaust still overshadows the memory of the region, so it's also of importance here. But it's not only about the past. What resonated in the region as well was this famous or rather unfamous essay by Vladimir Putin, the essay he published in 2021, when it turned out that, in fact, he presented the logic of contingency of all those small and medium-sized countries, and in particular, of course, Ukraine. So, as doubt is cast even on the presence on the map of some countries, they experience their sovereignty in a fragile, in a nervous way. This is where the phenomenon of post-traumatic sovereignty stops. And when we take Poland's, and in fact Polish-Lithuanian example for the purposes of this seminar, one may argue that already the partitions in the late 18th century changed the entire perception of Polish history for Poles themselves. Polish-Lithuanian history, I should underline all the time. It changed the perception of Poles themselves, and it influenced heavily historiography. It's interesting to see that, for instance, a prominent Polish historian, late Professor Janusz Tazbir, he wrote that without that partitions changed the whole perception of Polish history, and it still influences how Poles think of themselves. And it's not only about history, but very much so. It's also that this perception of its own history still has an impact on collective identity, and revives anxieties about the possible re-loss of sovereignty, about the repetition of history. So when we are looking at key political decisions after 1989, we could see clearly the influence on the political class to join NATO in 1999 and the European Union 2004, because it was not only when we are looking at the motivations, public statements, etc. It was not only about joining the wealthiest part of the globe. Of course, it was one of the purposes, but it was also about leaving the Russian sphere of influence. And there was this term that I like very much, to escape the trap of history. that was used also at that time. So and this became 2004. It looks like the mission is accomplished, and here we go. It is also a problem because joining the European Union became a problem for part of the political class that still thinks in terms of keeping the high level of sovereignty. This might seem paradoxical. How is it possible that the same EU that was supposed to guarantee sovereignty is now threatening it? Old heart is dry heart. The fear of losing sovereignty is so well ingrained in the collective consciousness that some people may be easily persuaded by the argument that so-called Brussels is nothing more than a new Moscow, and that the EU membership is some kind of cultural, political, and economic domination over Poland. It's not about the facts; it's about how it is presented. So it's interesting to see that here is a meeting point where the influence from Western far-right populist slogans is meeting with a kind of tradition of self-perception, of seeing your sovereignty as threatened. So the whole agenda of the Europe of Nations that was coined before 2004, obviously, simply met easily with this self-perception. But you may ask why we are talking also about trauma, about the post-traumatic sovereignty. Here I'm referring to one of the definitions of trauma, a dramatic event, but not only an event that happened in the past. It is also the mark that this event has left on the mind, brain and body. Usually, the being wiped off the map was associated with events of highest level of violence. We are studying the interdisciplinary study of trauma. Is focuses on victims of disasters as diverse as genocide, war, earthquakes, etc. But it's interesting to see, and here I'm necessarily I'm doing a shortcut. What is interesting is that the concept of trauma has now is also a sociological and moral category, but not only, it's also a political and legal category. If you are traumatized, you could sue someone. So again, it's a shortcut, but the trauma studies are interdisciplinary, and here I'm trying to examine the hypothesis that the repeated loss of statehood and sovereignty, often accompanied by episodes of violence, can also be cause of collective trauma. And it starts very early, because in fact, when we are seeing the partitions of Poland in the 18th century already, all of these events were associated with high level of violence, including massacres, and massacres that were not only limited to the political elites, but also we had such events as a massacre in Warsaw that took place in the 18th century, and virtually that was not about elites at all. So it's interesting, and here I would like to underline that Poland is treated by me as just one of many examples of this phenomenon, along with other countries of the region, Ukraine, the Baltic states, Romania, but also perhaps we should think of this approach that I'm proposing more ambitiously, and ask ourselves about Taiwan and Israel. But that's for another discussion, perhaps. For
Poles, and we were talking before our seminar about books on trauma that were published in Poland, and rightly so, because we have tools to examine Polish traumas, and here the Second World War is obviously a very important point of reference. We simply are talking about the trauma that was also ingrained in the Polish culture. It is transferred through not only through the public but also through the private sphere. It is, I mean, as simple as that. Very often these are the stories told by grandmothers to grandchildren, and this is of such an importance that now when Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, is trying to explain why we should support the Baltic states, and she does it for the purposes of in the Western media, she is referring to her private story. She's talking about her family. So because it may sound too abstract to talk about being wiped off the map. So she says, when my country lost sovereignty, half of my family ended up in Siberia. So again, it's a shortcut, but this is how she presents it. And we know that she's referring to the language of traumas, in fact. And the language of trauma has been is very present now in historiography as well. For instance, there is this wonderful book written by Richard Overy on the Second World War, and he uses the phrase the geography, emotional geography. In fact, he's writing about traumas of the Second World War, not really referring to Poland. So we are talking about being wiped off the map. In the case of Poland and Lithuania, it means that we have even the cycle of being wiped off the map. It's interesting. It's at the time when William Pitt the Younger was in office as British Prime Minister, and the French Revolution was entering its post-Robespierre phase. The first Polish-Lithuanian state was wiped off the map for the first time. 1792 is the point of reference, and it's interesting to see that for our historiography, but also for our collective way of transmitting the self-stereotype, it's important to underline that, for instance, in France, we are referring to the political regimes, First Republic, Second Republic, Third Republic. In Poland, we are referring to the partitions of Poland, first partition of Poland, second, third, but also the fourth, the beginning of the Second World War. So it is the way of binding history together when one doesn't have a state. It's interesting to see that there are some counter narratives, counter methods of binding history together when we lost the state. And what is more, and I cannot really go into the anecdotes that are really super interesting. We have some, even the third partition of Poland could be seen from the perspective of today's research on trauma, because we have some pieces that some puzzle that could be gathered together. And for instance, the last king of Poland, the ancient king Stanisław August Poniatowski, according to some notes, became hysterical before signing the act of abdication, which was put under his nose by an impatient official of Catherine II. What he suffered a severe nervous attack and did not rise from his bed for 3 days. So this is one of examples, but not only. And Christopher Clark, the historian, he quotes that after one of the partitions, when Prussians took over a part of the territory, of the Polish-Lithuanian territory, the Polish nobility was no longer what it had been. An element of bitterness entered its character and a distrust of German that will long endure. Of course, perhaps the pinnacle of these cultural references is the Polish anthem, as simple as that, where we have the answer to the question, is Poland dead? Poland is not dead as long as we are alive, and it's always interesting to see that there is an echo of this phrase in the Ukrainian anthem as well. So again, it's something that should be analyzed more broadly. Why it matters? Fast forward, 1989 was marked not only the end of the communist ideology, the end of the Cold War also meant that the Polish state regained sovereignty after decades of subservience to Russia. And to be precise, the most important moment, in fact, was not 1989 from this perspective, but 1993, when the Russian troops left the country. And it was as if 300 years cycle achieved its end, because for the first time it was during the reign of Peter the Great. And it's interesting that again it was remarked when Vladimir Putin remarked that Peter the Great and Catherine II, the Great, are his heroes, personal heroes, and examples to be followed, which simply was not really welcomed by those who knows what it means from history. So at the first historical opportunity, Poland and other countries of the region decided to escape to the west from the Russian sphere of influence. So as we talked about joining NATO, and it was the beginning of this bifurcation that is so interesting. And as I promised, we are moving forward to the current politics. Why it is important? Because after 2004, in fact, not really after 1989, but in fact after 2004, two currents of different attitudes towards sovereignty emerged in Poland, and it's far from being over. The first, defining the threat primarily in those new circumstances in the East, obviously referring to an increasingly authoritarian Russia. But the second current is perceiving a threat both in the East and in the West. In the latter case, in addition to Moscow, it is also so. And here we have a whole choice: so-called Brussels, Germany, or the West sometimes. But the main thing is to see a threat not only in the East but also in the West. And what it means, it is that the governments could be seen from this perspective as incarnation of those trends. So the first two governments of Donald Tusk, so 2007, 2015, could be seen from this perspective that it was simply the policy of joining, of escaping the Russia sphere of influence. It was a continuation of previous politics with some attempts to approach Russia, but again under from the inspiration of the US. That's something that we could talk over later. But then we have the 8 years of the government of law and justice, so from 2015 to 2023, and here was the threat was perceived both in the East and in the West. So these two governments could be seen as incarnations of these two trends. Definitely, the collapse of communism left Poles in search of their new identity, and it's not a slogan because it's so easy to say that, but it's real, because it is the moment so unprecedented that we have also young Poles that were born and brought up in their own sovereign state. So that's something unprecedented. To look for a president, one must go back to the pre-partition era, so before the 18th century, which shows how challenging is this the question of cultural codes, modes of behavior, especially that the question behind it is, should they be abandoned? And after 1989, there were numerous intellectuals who were for it. We should abandon all those cultural codes of pre-1989 era because it's harmful. We should simply be Europeans. We should support the process of federalization of the European Union and so on. But after 2014 and obviously after February 2022, it's not so obvious. It's not so obvious. As far as I remember, it was it's the question of last a couple of days that Russians took over 300 kilometers of Ukrainian territory. They are moving very quickly. So it means that the cultural codes of how to survive without your state, live it or not, there is a sense of not only of uncertainty but also of political choice, because it would be easy to say, okay, let's just leave behind the whole culture that we had that helped, that helped small and medium-sized nations to survive times without their own independent state. But when we are remembering that in the culture there is the whole self-perception that we are living from cycle to cycle of being wiped off the map of the state that's being wiped off the map, it means that this is not so obvious to live the culture of defending sovereignty. I'm saying it without making my own choice. It's just a question of sketching the political dilemma. This loss of sovereignty argument is constantly in play in Polish politics. And here I'm really referring to the up-to-date politics. In the public sphere, obviously the Law and Justice government was defending Poland against Brussels, Germany, and so on and so forth. It was one of the main framings of presenting politics to the voters, to the citizens. But at the same time, the opposition did the same, but in another frame. For instance, when the conservative, liberal, and left opposition to Law and Justice wanted to warn against the Law and Justice government, they were referring to the so-called Polexit, Poland leaving the European Union. And there is, well, as such, it could be, well, it's a kind of Brexit. No, it's referring to Polish history again. There is an assumption that is hidden, but it's absolutely clear for Poles that Polexit would mean to find itself in a gray zone, geopolitical gray zone, and therefore losing sovereignty to Russia again. That was implicit. That was, so Polexit was again about losing sovereignty as a political argument. So we also see that the post-traumatic sovereignty, as interpreted in some by the Law and Justice government, became something more than a local problem, because in the end, in 2021, we had this pan-European constitutional dispute, because for the Law and Justice government presented the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland about the supremacy of Polish law over EU law as defending sovereignty. So again, this argument was used for the sake of this anti-Brussels policy, and this sovereignty defense framing turned out to be a pan-European problem. Then it was not only about Poland itself. So as we are approaching the end of my time, I would like to underline that fear of losing sovereignty that is founded on historical experience, that is transferred through public and private sphere, that in fact is omnipresent, may lead to both weaken and deepen the European integration, for instance. So it's a paradox, but it could do both. Then it's also the question of interpretation. I would like to be really understood. The post-traumatic sovereignty is referring to the events that took place in the past, but the question of interpretation is fully open. And what is more, from Hungarian example, maybe that's for the discussion, we know that the government, populist government, could even choose trauma, because so many horrible things happened in the region, but it's also the question of choosing trauma. The politics of choosing. The post-traumatic sovereignty, therefore, is a kind of filter, that shapes politics, that influences political choices, that today justifies such tangible political decision as to sustain almost 4% of GDP to spend on military, not on other public institutions. It also means that there is that regardless the government, Tusk or Kaczynski, there is clearly the transatlantic option chosen. That the migration is also presented, the migration issue is also presented as the question of defending the country and its sovereignty. That's perhaps another subject that we could discuss later on. And of course, Donald Trump's re-election is also mainly judged from what it means geopolitically for Ukraine, but also for Poland. That does it mean that we are threatened again? So what I'm proposing is this post-traumatic sovereignty filter to understand Polish politics. Thank you so much.
So first of all, I would like to say thanks to Jarek, because it has been a fascinating book to read and to gain a deeper understanding of the broader political context. I have to say I'm not an expert on Poland, but I have been following the developments, I should say, since the beginning of the 90s. And it was very interesting to gain a new perspective in terms of understanding the sensitivities and the significance of different political messages and their power. And it was also particularly interesting to explore how populist parties have utilized this collective sensitivities and issues to develop their message. I think that I want to talk a little bit more in terms of a broader comparative perspective and probably a reflection on the European Union integration dimension and the future of the European project. Because one thing that I have found particularly fascinating throughout the book is that the notion that you are either protecting or so the European Union or their different sources that will either protect or threaten sovereignty. And one thing that has been missing from the discussion and is broadly missing from political debates is the French perception of how European Union enhances or multiplies sovereignty. So it provides an opportunity and platform to not just share your sovereignty with somebody else, but to multiply the power that you have and project your policies on a global stage through the process of European integration. And this is something that, I mean, again, in the context of Central and Eastern Europe, we have seen very few. I cannot even think of politicians who are framing or rethinking sovereignty through these lenses, but it has been very much the case in the Brexit debate. We have also seen this kind of win-lose situation. So by joining the European Union, you are losing your sovereignty, and there hasn't been enough of a debate and a discussion about the opportunities and the platform that you're just transforming sovereignty rather than losing it or protecting it. So I think that this is a very interesting and important point to consider. And I think that one of the reasons why this might be the case in the context of Central and Eastern Europe is what we have seen, and we recently had an event a few weeks ago about reflecting on the extent to which Central and Eastern European voices have been heard or mattered in the context of EU policy making. And the broad observation is that almost after 2 decades, there has been very little contribution from Central and Eastern Europe towards the development of different EU policies. But I think remarkably, I guess in the case of some countries like Poland, Central and Eastern Europeans have for a very long time not been listened to. Their voices have been ignored and neglected. And I mean, again, whether we think about the EU's policy towards Russia is perhaps one of the most glaring examples. We can see why this message is much more perhaps resonant with citizens in Central and Eastern Europe, and the distance that has been built between Warsaw, Bucharest, or Tallinn and Brussels is wider and deeper. Because another exercise that is also very common by populists throughout Europe, not just in Eastern Europe, we have seen it very much utilized by politicians in Western Europe as well, is to kind of paint this us versus the elite in Brussels, or we have Poland versus Brussels, we will have Italy or UK versus these people who happen to be there in Brussels. So there is this complete detachment from all the political processes and from the fact that we have national politicians who are at the table when a number of important decisions are being made. So I find it fascinating. On few glimpses, we can see that by having this contribution from Central and Eastern Europe, we have perhaps created a layer of alienation, and populist messages could resonate perhaps strongly with Central and Eastern European citizens that we don't matter, nobody cares about us. And I guess this also leads into another theme which we have touched on regarding the threat to sovereignty and whether the European Union could provide protection. The sense of abandonment, I guess it's also very much a common theme, and a theme that is very much present in Central and Eastern Europe. And I guess in some countries, citizens might be more concerned if something is to happen, particularly if you happen to be bordering Russia, whether NATO or EU fellow member states will be there or will they not abandon you again? So I think that this is perhaps also another important message that has been used to kind of build this sense of alienation and also make the message particularly stronger. So I think that this is important to consider and to reflect. Another thing that I also wanted to mention is perhaps coming from Southeastern Europe, it's particularly interesting that there is a much more nuanced attitude when it comes towards Russia. And the reference points are not necessarily from the 20th century. Perhaps the reference points will be from the end of the 19th century when we were liberated from Russia. So having, I guess, in that respect, the Baltic states and Poland have heightened sensitivities when it comes to losing territory, while perhaps in other Central and Eastern European countries, historical contexts have been more complicated or complex. So that's why we have seen the emergence of different narratives. I think Hungary is quite a stark example in terms of how different historical events have been reinterpreted. And now we have Hungary, basically for a very long time, the only country either weakening the EU sanctions or trying to block a range of EU sanctions, so just undermining the united front of different EU member states. Now there are concerns about Slovakia, and we will find out in 2 weeks what is going to happen in Romania if we are going to have an alliance of 3 countries. I mean, again, Bulgaria is perhaps a much more ambiguous part of this equation of conversation, as it's impossible to have a government, but we'll see maybe another round of elections next year and see how. I think the most interesting thing in that respect is that Poland and the Baltic states have, over the last 2 years, worked very closely together and tried to build alliance with different EU member states to communicate their concerns in a way that is not misunderstood, or because I think that for a very long period of time we had this conception of Central and Eastern Europeans as being very unreasonable, irrational, or emotional, and easily dismissed. And I mean, I think in the scope of 2 decades, and we've had also some members of the European Parliament who had visitors here at Oxford, and they have noted the fact that Central and Eastern Europeans would not be trusted with portfolios regarding Eastern Europe or Russia, because they were perceived to be too emotionally attached, to have too strong baggage to deal with these cases or with these countries. And I think that this kind of loss of knowledge and, importantly, loss of understanding has hindered European project greatly, not just the ability of the region to communicate effectively the challenges and the issues and the experiences that they've had. So in that respect, I think that Kaja Kallas, you have mentioned her, has been a great communicator in terms of trying to share this experience and also help develop a common or shared understanding of the concerns of different EU member states. And we've had the event 2 weeks ago, I think, Christy Reich, and she was basically saying the Baltic states do no longer think of themselves as Eastern European, that they have become Nordic, and this is the identity and the closer relationships that have been working with other Nordic countries, building alliances as well as with Poland. So it's quite interesting to see the shifts, because you have mentioned from Finland to Romania, and obviously also Finland, and they have changed their foreign policy and applied to become a member of NATO. So there has been also another important development on this front. And this leads me to another point, which I think is also very interesting. You have developed a very illuminating discussion in terms of how Polish national identity has been built and the key narratives. And I was particularly impressed by how strong it is and how universal it is. Particularly in the context of how there is much more room for interpretation in some of the other Central and Eastern European member states. We have mentioned Hungary as an example. In Bulgaria, we have seen this debate. The level of support for the European Union was among one of the highest in the EU and has been gradually dropping. And now we see more than 20% of the population in Bulgaria arguing that they have not benefited from EU membership, or this the question when it comes to is the US or EU, is the US or Russia partner or alliance, we have seen the emergence of very important and quite important shifts and splits. I think Slovakia, along those similar lines, we have seen as well this kind of broad reflection and divergence. And also, importantly, we've talked a lot about national identity, but clearly we have failed to build a common European narrative. So European identities in terms of understanding the challenges that other Europeans face I mean, again, to what extent Portugal could be sympathetic to some of the developments and anxieties of the Baltic states. There is this question to what extent they have been communicated, shared, and we have this common or shared understanding of the challenges, the threats that we have, and how to deal with them. So I think that this is perhaps particularly important regarding the ongoing debate that we have in the European Union and the future direction of the European project, how to develop this common understanding in order to deal and create a common joint vision for the future of the European Union. And I think this is very important given the fact that enlargement is back on the agenda. And the question of what would other Eastern Europeans do when they become members of the European Union? There is still quite a lot of misconception and misunderstanding, I think, widely shared, not just among politicians, but also of the general wider public in West European member states have not a comprehensive understanding of the issues and the challenges and the impact more Eastern European member states joining and becoming members of the European Union. So ultimately, I think we need to have a broader and more complex understanding. In your book, that's why I think it's a fantastic addition in terms of helping us communicate and build a shared meaning and shared understanding. And I think that I will stop at this point because I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions as well. But an excellent book. Congratulations again. I very much enjoyed reading it.
Very much, Eddie. Well, one lesson from both the talk and response is history matters. I mean, if you're talking about attitudes to Russia and the contrast between northeastern Europe and southeastern Europe, it's which empire were you in, right? Poland, Finland, Baltic states, Russian Empire, clear response. Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria now, and the Hungary, Slovakia, different response, and then former Ottoman Empire, different again. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, comments. I can see multiple hands already. Okay, so I'm going to group you already, guys. Me. Okay. Hang on. Keep your hands up, please, because there are so many. I don't think I've ever seen so many hands go up at once. Yeah, so two in here. There we are. Yeah, my good. Okay. Okay, we're going to group them in three, starting with Robert. If you could just mention your name, affiliation.
Robert Pyra, Worcester College. So just I'll try and be brief and not do the Polish speech, if you don't mind me saying Polish speechifying instead of asking a question. But it's not a question, so in that sense it is a classic Polish. So I immediately thought, and others in the room may as well have done, of Timothy Snyder's article, because I loved your focus on sovereignty, sovereignty over memory versus the memory of sovereignty. So the idea of overcoming the past and overcoming trauma. You're saying Poland hasn't. I would just posit a really small case in which it has, because obviously asserting sovereignty can imply, especially in Central Europe, taking somebody else's away. So Ukraine's, for example, if we look at Poland, and we talked about this just before, didn't we? If we look at Poland in a broad historical sense, in theory, there's the loss of lands which are now in Ukraine. I've just written trying to finish a book on Lvov in the Polish context. And what's really interesting about that is it's hugely traumatic for Poland. The exile culture literature talks about it extensively, but actually there's no recidivism. It's tiny in Poland. So I would argue that is sovereignty over memory. That traumatic memory, as we've gone into even beyond post-memory, has been overcome. So just that tiny comment and that helpful, hopefully, distinction by Timothy Snyder of sovereignty over memory versus memory of sovereignty.
Thanks very much, Demeter.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I was reminded.
Could you just say who you are, folks?
Dimitar Bechev, I'm the head of the Darembo project working with them on Europe in the changing world. So I was reminded of a book I read recently about China. In Chinese, it turns out there was a verb to Poland, which meant to wipe out and to destroy. Although Chinese revolutionaries took a positive example that all those countries were reborn after the First World War. So there was a Polish model, if you will, for China. But my question is really about Germany, which you mentioned in passing. And I'll be curious to get your reflection on how this memory is reflected on the debate about Germany, because there have been so many different and clashing articulations from law and justice demanding reparations, all the way to Radek Sikorski, somebody who came from this party, but then transitioned to other forces, famously saying that he actually wants more Germany, more German leadership. And he said it, I say it as a Pole, so he underscores his Polish identity and everything in between. So this battle of how you frame Germany is a sort of a mirror of all the law and how you reflect on your past will be something I'll be curious to get your thinking about.
Thanks very much. Tony.
Sabina Hughes, I'm a professor of English literature at Jesus College. I wanted to put a little bit of pressure on your concept of post-traumatic sovereignty. You referred to Baudin. Do you subscribe to the notion of indivisible sovereignty, or are you thinking of redefining it as shared sovereignty? Because so much really depends on how we actually understand the concept, and in terms of post-traumatic. So the question always is whose trauma, and you were emphasizing Polish trauma. But just what happens when Poland regains independence in 1989 and inflict trauma on others, getting hold of Lviv or especially Vilnius. So I just wondered how you would finesse that side of things.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Thank you for all those questions. It's wow, such a pleasure. Always such a pleasure to have a discussion here. The first question about well, in fact, the memory of sovereignty, it's extremely important because, for instance, when at the end of the First World War, Pilsudski had in mind the map of the first Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That was his goal, to achieve the old frontiers, which seemed to be an absurd 19th century when we are using contemporary terms of what's the nation, which the birth of nations or reconstruction of nations, to refer to one of the books. But it mattered little. The question was of the point of reference. So obviously there is a competition, and here I would join it to the first question that we clearly see in the contemporary world the competitions of traumas. That it's not that the one who was traumatized cannot traumatize someone else. It's the question of weaponization of traumas, as I wanted to underline that one could choose the trauma, and it can be because when the starting point was to look for a remedy for the traumas from the past. But over time, the traumas topic became so important and grew in importance, reaching the level of politics. And here is obviously the whole area for an abuse that could be seen. So I think that what is important is to start to talk about it as not to leave it as something that should be left, because it's an area very prone to abuses, political abuse. Absolutely, it's incredible. We have mentioned Hungary. That is an extremely interesting example, because Hungary could have chosen another trauma. Why not 1956? And it's extremely interesting to see the evolution of Viktor Orban's policy, that he simply moved from 56, and in fact it's not only 56, it's also 1849. So he moved from 56 to Trianon, and here we go. It was a political choice, because it means that the Trianon cannot be used. I mean, there's nothing about Russia, in fact. So Trianon could be used as a political tool against his vision of the West. So there is a whole question of, and again, whose trauma? The third question. This is what is. I'll reverse this question. What was interesting, by the way, the SWPS book on the nation in schools, in Polish schools. What was interesting about this research is that it turned out that virtually it's been 35 years and very little changed in practice. There's always a quarrel about manuals. There's always a quarrel about the program at schools, history and literature. But this research is interesting because it was about how it is in practice, and it turned out that very little changed. That in fact the mainstream of the program at schools is simply focused on the same mainstream narrative of history. So there is a huge gap between the world of research that analyzes a lot of issues like social history, etc., and what we have at schools. What it means, for me, it is interesting because it means that politically speaking, it explains a lot why it is better to stick to this conservative interpretation, because they are widespread. They are still transferred further on. So this is something that resonates in the data, and of course there is this competition of traumas not only between politicians, but also it may be a dangerous tool when we are trying to focus on our traumas at the expense of traumas of others. As I understand, that was for instance about Ukraine. Yeah, that we could, for instance, that we could expose our traumas at the expense of the harm that was done to the others. But this is exactly the reason why we should talk about it. I think that we should not leave it as the mainstream of history that is simply transferred from one generation to another, and in practice very little changes. What brings us the outcome in politics. And as to Germany, the Germany question, it's interesting with Jarosław Sikorski. He is not only he not only referred to the Germany's policy that he would like to have it more of Germany in foreign policy, in European politics. First of all, I don't think it's this phrase would have been repeated by him. He changed his attitude, but before saying that, he had this phrase, and I'm quoting it. He referred to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline as another Ribbentrop-Molotov pact. Okay, so that was his set of association, by the way, as to the trauma. So I think that definitely I fully agree that Germany is a part of, it could be also a mirror of Polish attitudes towards their identity, but it changes, and there is a clear post-populist influence, because what we see now in many ways is the influence of the previous government on Donald Tusk. One cannot really deny it.
Great.
Also, Kate and David.
Thank you very much, Jarek. I'm also known as the Section of European Studies Center here. Now, it's very interesting, but I found it a little bit one-dimensional, in the sense that if we're to believe that this traumatic and post-traumatic unsovereignty really affects the way that our politics are conducted, it kind of, what about how sustainable it's actually to build an identity on victimhood
and resentment. I mean, there must be also the counter narratives in Poland that allow for this identity to be built. So I would like to ask you, because I think that these are equally important as well. Otherwise, we're going to have a complete misunderstanding of what the Polish elites are or the Polish people are. But what is also interesting is that you spoke about the instrumentalization of this trauma, which I think is very, very important and is done by both sides. So that is what I wanted to, it is a bit one-dimensional, in my opinion, in order to understand exactly what is happening today in Poland.
Thanks.
Kate LeBeau, I'm a historian here at Oxford. And yeah, thank you very much for a really thought-provoking talk. And I also want to push you a little bit. I feel that there's a tension between what you call the politics of choosing trauma, which is a phrase I find very useful, and a sort of assumption about some, really existing ontological thing that Poles have experienced around loss of sovereignty. And so, my question is a little bit similar to Paulina's, sort of which trauma and whose trauma. And to give two examples, the author Aneta Promaka-Onisz found, upon interviewing elderly people in her region in northeastern Poland, that it was the memory of the mass forced expulsions and migrations of World War I that were the original trauma that had been passed along in those families, right? And she would explicitly be told it was much worse than World War II, right? Now that is not the standard narrative of, Polish trauma. Another example is, with this upsurge of interest in Historia Ludowa, folk history, people's history, right? The idea of the trauma, the physical violence inflicted on serfs, right? As another kind of original trauma. And as we know, sort of Polish sovereignty was not something that really kind of gripped the imaginations of the majority of the ancestors of today's Poles until well into the 20th century, right? So whose trauma is this? And is there a problem in a way of using the metaphor of trauma, which implies kind of organic coherence to an entity like Poland, rather than thinking about the politics and the power dynamics of whose traumas are elevated into these narratives?
Thanks, Emma. I hope we're not going to traumatize you with all the
David Mountain with Sea Socks. Thank you for great presentations. I loved the phrase, the trap of history. Is it possible for countries to escape the trap of history?
Thank you. Thank you for all those questions. I think that, well, obviously, the word counter narrative, and I think that your questions, two questions were in the same vein. There were counter narratives, and even at the end of the first civic platform government, there were attempts made to impose them from above. That famous or unfamous eagle made of chocolate that was supposed to present a new way of being a patriot. It became so ridiculous that Jarosław Komorowski was he hesitated if to pardon or not, but he was asked on numerous occasions he perhaps should do it. It's not about the one politician that perhaps perhaps the chocolate was not good enough, but it's not about him. It's about being ready that to revise the narratives. And I believe that I presented it in a shortcut, but it's a process. I try to underline it's a process. So it's a process that after 35 years, we are perhaps ready to have the people's history, the people's history that is considered not to be a communist propaganda that can, because in fact, we had such books before 1989 and a lot of them. But now it is treated in a different way as yours. And perhaps it was the question of more than 30 years that to be ready to see that it's not only about the nobleman slash intelligentsia narrative on Poland, but it's also about other groups. And the first nobleman slash intelligentsia narrative was necessary. It was about the high culture. It was necessary for the period of survival. At any rate, that was the fact. But now we have tools, also academic tools, to focus on the traumas of others. Then we are ready, because, and that's the question of could we escape the trap of history. I think that if we see it not as an event, but as a process, we already see that there is a kind of cognitive dissonance that was overcome by new generations, because for them it was the question of living in a sovereign country and getting a non-sovereign narrative at schools. So it is the question of getting out of it. And here is the question. Here we have these counter narratives that are becoming visible, and it's possible to hear them. You see that it's possible to hear them. They could be heard by the audience, because they were in the 90s, they were before, and now we have an unprecedented thing that the book on peasant women is such a bestseller that it sold over 500,000 of copies. I mean, it's a bestseller, and it's been a bestseller in years. So, but people are ready. It turned out that it's time. So perhaps it's just a question of evolving, with one footnote, as I tried to stress. Seeing the geopolitical development, there is still this question: should we abandon this culture, so nuanced and refined, in fact, the culture of not independence but dependence, of survival, strategies of survival? Should we leave them, seeing what's going on in the world? There is nobody knows the answer, but there is the reason why at least a part of the political scene could say, oh, it's a good, one should be cautious.
Marek, I think, yeah.
I'm Marek Naczyk, I'm a political scientist, and I work in the social policy department. I'd like to hear a little bit from you, a little bit more about what post-traumatic vision of sovereignty for Poland should be. Kind of what a liberal, more progressive view of sovereignty for Poland should be. And I'm glad that Ellie, right, mentioned the French view of sovereignty. I'm, by the way, not French, I'm Brussels born, but I was also educated in France, so that view is close to me. And right, of Europe as enhancing sovereignty, and also what the role of strengthening the Polish state should be in promoting a more progressive view of sovereignty, because as you know, Law and Justice has been very critical of liberals' view of the state, right? Of liberals often wanting to weaken the state, and Law and Justice has been one of the points it makes when it defends us, right, Polish sovereignty, is that we also need to have a stronger state. And honestly, I think Law and Justice has pointed in making that point. Obviously, the answers it gives are wrong, but if you actually think about the French state, right, and so if you think about what a strong state is, the French example comes to mind, obviously, and one of the reasons why France has, the whole French political class, obviously, has been often quite positive about European integration is that having a strong state, it's also very much able to influence what happens in Brussels, right? It's not just about taking the Thalys or the Eurostar, the Thalys to Brussels, but it's also, right? But it's also about sending your own people doing entrisme in Brussels, right? Having strong elites
that you can place in Brussels, right? And then via that networking get benefits for France. But to be able to do that, you need a strong state apparatus with strong civil service, which Britain, by the way, also has, Germany also has, with strong procedures, which means strong rule of law, which Poland doesn't have. And I think there's space there for liberals to rethink that. So I'm sorry, I'm pushing a little bit my own views on this, but I would like to hear what your views on this are.
If I may, I'm just going to take that on as saying it's such an important question, and I'd like Ellie to come in on this too. Weak states, strong states in the EU, but can I add to it a question about building back better after populism? And if you could tell us a little bit about, whether you think the state is actually being strengthened in a good liberal way, the rule of law, the civil service, public service, television, the position of universities, all those issues which, aspects which together make a strong liberal democratic state. Perhaps Eric first and then Eddie.
Well, thank you. And well, it's not a it's not about divisions, it's I don't see myself as a visionary for the future. I think that the path is already interesting enough to take care of it. But
have a go at the present if you're not.
But it's still difficult because the question was about the vision. Yeah? So the vision for Poland, I think that it's much more difficult now than it used to be. And partially I would refer to your question, Tim, that in fact it was much easier enough after 1989. A piece I co-wrote for Foreign Affairs. I'm trying to make a comparison between two transitional justices. Because there was the first transitional justice that took place after 1989, and that it's very illuminating to make this comparison, because it shows us that at that time, for instance, the communist ideology was dead, also in the eyes of those who were members of the ex-communist party. It matters because today, when we are making comparison, the populism, even as a thin ideology, is alive. Is alive. It changes everything because, for instance, our new Minister of Justice, he has a tremendous challenge to fight with this populist Ivy structure that was, in fact, that is omnipresent. And very often in the media we see, oh, Poland, it's again on its pro-democratic path. It's absolutely not true, and I'm saying that not to discourage anyone, but to show to underline the complexity of the things. What was regained by the so-called pro-democratic side of the political scene was the legislative and only the part of the executive. Because still we have the part of the executive in the hands of Andrzej Duda, our president, who is from the law and justice milieu. So he is actively blocking any kind of more ambitious reform, which is of importance here. And then the judiciary that was virtually heavily influenced by law and justice, and we see it in the Constitutional Tribunal that is using its tools, and it's extremely complicated, legally speaking. They are using the tools to block reforms. For instance, the reforms even such as should we limit hours of religion at schools? And then the Constitutional Tribunal gives a ruling or pseudo-ruling, according to those who disagree with it. So it's extremely complicated because we have what I called a legal minefield left by the previous government, and the battle is going on. This legal battle is going on. This is virtually the civil war of lawyers, because they do not surrender. They don't surrender. And here again, I would go back to the ideological dimension. Why? Because unlike communists or ex-communists, they still believe they could be back in power. So, especially seeing what happened in the USA, they are even more motivated. And according to this week's data, the Law and Justice got 6% of support, according to the polls, public opinion survey from CEBOS, 6%.
Extra support.
Extra support. Classics. So unfortunately, it's not that simple. So, and one more thing, perhaps about this French example. Alain Finkielkraut, for instance, and intellectuals who think in that way, they are using Eastern Europe to show, and this is the perversity of using Milan Kundera by him. He's using Milan Kundera to say, look, what he wrote, it could happen to us. We are threatened as a nation. It's absolutely interesting. He does it. I mean, Alain Finkielkraut does it. It's a very refined use of Milan Kundera, a famous essay, and he's not the only one, because the remplacement eventually refers to the same fears. So I'm not so sure about this French example, because this is an open question, and especially that there is the whole ambiguity of French political class towards Europe. Even Jacques Chirac, who was the one who wanted to have a referendum on deepening the EU with France, when he was young, he gave us he gave us speech, this Cochin speech that was clearly anti-European. So it is simply not so easy to use this example. Could we build it in a better way? Yes, but it's much more difficult than it used to be. We are much more disoriented. We are not sure if national populists are not going back to power. It's absolutely thinkable. And what is more, who is going to be president is an open question.
Thanks so much. Ellie.
I have a more optimistic take, actually. I think that there are very good reasons why we should be particularly hopeful, optimistic about developments in Poland. But I would like to look at civil society, because the strength, the resilience, the level of mobilization which was achieved this year has been truly impressive, and I think that this is going to make a substantial and significant difference. I do not disagree with you about the challenges within the state institutions, but I think what we have seen is quite a remarkable example of civil society mobilization. And I think that it's key because, I've had the pleasure to interview some civil society activists in Poland, and basically there is a broader debate in terms of sharing best practices, establishing a network, and using the knowledge that has been gained to help other countries, not just in Europe, but in a much broader and global context. So I think it's important to consider that, and on this note, I think it's also very important to go back to Marek's point. And I think that part of the success civil society in Poland has been developing networks and connections with different institutions and politicians who are based in Brussels to make sure that their voice is clearly heard, the scale of the challenge is properly understood. And one thing that I have found particularly fascinating is the insistence that the message was delivered in a calm, rational kind of way. It wasn't too emotional, that there was a fine line that you have to hit a particular scale of emotions in order to be taken seriously or to communicate the scale of what was happening in Poland. Because another thing that I have found particularly fascinating, basically most of the initiatives that have been credited to the European Union have been initially devised or very much lobbied by civil society organizations in Poland, and obviously neither they nor the EU were particularly vocal about it. But I think recognizing this agency will also help us to change the narrative about thinking of Central and Eastern Europe as this place where only democratic backsliding happens. We have authoritarian leaders, so we have populists. We have so much more diversity, and importantly, strong civil society, particularly in Poland. I think Romania is also an interesting and important example. So that's why I'm optimistic, and I hope that in the next 2 weeks we are going to see a particularly strong level of mobilization in Romania, because I think the fundamental questions about the direction and the future orientation of the country are being asked, that again have fundamental significance, not just for Romania or Eastern Europe, but broadly for the EU and the region. And if I might abuse my position, I just wanted to, I think it was Otten's points, to quickly jump in. I think your question was about the instrumentalization of trauma. And what is common among different populists is that they fear it's very helpful to develop a strong message that resonates with different members of the society. And I think that fears have been exploited by politicians, left, right, well, mostly from the right, but widely. And I think that the sense of loss is a very powerful message to be utilized with this loss of territory, which is particularly prominent in the case of Poland. We can talk about loss of people. I think that this is broader Central and Eastern European, that we're going to disappear from the map, precisely because we have particularly a very bad trends regarding a population, and depopulation is a major issue. In the UK, the sense loss of status, I think, was also very much prominent in the Brexit debate, the references to become again a great power, to have our own independence and make key decisions about the future, about loss of connections or about loss of influence, because I think that some have argued that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has been the last step after it has lost its influence over the territory of Ukraine to go and take on a full-scale invasion of the country. So the sense of loss has been used in different ways to justify and to mobilize. I think it's particularly a common theme across used by different populists.
Thanks very much, Eddie. 2 questions in the front row.
Okay, I'll start. I'm Bartosz. I'm reading for Masters in Public Policy at the Liberalna School of Government. So maybe first a quick comment, and then I'll jump into my question. I think, like, on your point, I totally agree. I run an NGO that focuses on civil service reform in Poland, so I know how hard it is to actually get somebody to think about it. I think our historical problem is that we, as a country, as Poland, we have had very different episodes where we had portions of our state working well. I know, the army, industry, whatever. It was never the foreign affairs issue. Never in history were we good at it. So we basically inherently don't know how to play the game. Like, that's the part. If you ask somebody what's like the long-term raison d'etat in Poland, we don't have it. It's like it's still a matter of debate. And as long as we don't have it, it's gonna be a problem. I wanted to ask you something as a person who was born in 1995. I've never experienced the loss of sovereignty. Never touched it. I only experienced it through books and through talking to people. Do you think, also in light of Timothy Snyder's article, that in the coming years or maybe a decade, it will lose its importance as a political tool in the debate, because people of my generation, they do not know that pain. It doesn't resonate with them. It's like, plus also we are a growing country, so with the sense of growing power, we replace the fear of being conquered, or our territory is taken over. So my feeling is that it will lose its power it has currently right now, because mostly the voters are like my parents and my grandparents who truly suffered. And like, we didn't. I spent most of my life in the EU.
Fascinating. I think it was the second row, actually.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Guillermo Iñiguez. I'm reading for my DPhil at the law faculty. My questions, I mean, it's sort of been touched upon. It links to the building back better point that you were making, but it's about the post-judicial reforms. It's sort of the aftermath of the judicial reforms once the Law and Justice Party lose power. And the question is the framework of sovereignty of the debate, the framework you set out in your talk, is it also playing out in the debates about how to unravel from maybe Adam Bodnar's point of view or from Duda's point of view, how to maintain the judicial reforms. Are we seeing a second iteration of this debate between the two approaches to sovereignty you mentioned in your talk?
Oh, lovely questions. Maybe I'll start with the second one. One of the first moves by Adam Bodnar was to join the EU Public Prosecution Office. That was as if to outsource our domestic problems. So in practice, this is the answer to your question, especially that in other respects, he's muddling through. It's extremely difficult process. Why? And here I could show you a more general remark. Because it was the question of political choice. Donald Tusk, he's not a lawyer, so probably he had no intuition, legal intuition, what could happen next when but he invited Adam Bodnar, and that was already a very important decision, because in fact, in a post-populist moment, we have like a bifurcation of possibilities. One is, one could try to return to the pre-2015 legal situation, which means to zero out everything. It's beautiful in theory, it's horrible in practice, and what is more, it is very close to breaking the law in many respects. But there is a justification that is black and white, and it has a very powerful not only legal but also moral motivation. Let's go back the pre-constitutional breakdown moment, and let's just get rid of all those pseudo judges from the Constitutional Tribunal. But there was a second path, and here is Adam Bodnar and Ewa Łętowska and many other lawyers. Let's look for a compromise. And you know what? After more than 1 year, it looks like perhaps it was better to choose the first one. This is my opinion. This is my opinion. Okay, it's such a it's like going through a kind of mud made of paragraphs. You don't really know if you are going to reach your end goal. And Adam Bodnar, whom I know, is in such a difficult situation. I really I'm full of respect to his efforts, but it's such an immense, it's such a task that you know it's politically it's difficult for supporters of civic platform to be read. No, it's not. It's absolutely. It's a horror to be understood by an so-called ordinary voter. Which means that if you suffered from populism, because that's another issue that was not mentioned, you know, the populism now gives a lot of dispersed suffering, a lot of small petty behaviors that are difficult to be seen, because usually when we are talking about tyranny and all those big metaphors or political regimes, it's easy to pinpoint there is a crime. Whereas populism is very much about pettiness and things that were directed to breaking people's careers, for instance. So you know, you are still alive. What is it all about? After in the post-totalitarian country, it could be even said that, you know, what a big deal. But the suffering was there, in fact, and a lot of people expected some kind of political revenge. Yes, it's a strong word, but that was seen in the public opinion surveys. And what could be seen now is that there is a sense of disappointment. Because for those who wanted to go this compromise path on the restoration of the rule of law, they have a much remoter goal in mind. We would like to restore the spirit of the laws, according to Montesquieu. And it's a noble, but who knows what it will bring in another election, because that's an open question. And as to the first question, I wrote the book about it. It's in Polish.
It's very
Yes. And it's exactly on this topic. I think that for many years it was believed that it's going to be an invisible hand of sovereignty that is going to resolve the problems. This is not the case. We should be more active. We should address this topic of this post-traumatic sovereignty, because when a lot of young people they got at schools the old software, it means that nothing is solved. And here,
yeah, thanks very much, Eric. By the way, on the rule of law point, János Kuisz, the very well-known Hungarian legal philosopher, argued very forcefully that sometimes you need to break the law in order to restore the rule of law, the condition of the rule of law. And he argued for a single revolutionary act. Now, the irony here is that one of the great constraints on this was the EU's understanding of the rule of law, which is black letter procedural. So all they would see is the breaking of the laws rather than the larger act of restoring the rule of law. It's a very interesting point. I think we come to the last round of questions. I have two people on my list, and I'm glad to see a hand right at the back who makes the third. So we'll start at the front with Katarzyna, then Antony Teasdale, and then right at the back.
Okay, am I first? Okay. Katarzyna Walecka, I'm political scientist, lecturer at Wodam College and visiting academic at OSCA this year. Thank you very much. I'll be coming back actually to your main thesis of the book that as we are come out, and it will link a little bit to that what Ellie said and also mentioned. How actually this because in what you present, the trauma is something implicit, that it's but I just would like to know how actually it fits in the broader politics of memory, because it's very much of you are looking at this sociological angle, I think, of trauma, but actually how we can take this trauma on this level of the creation by the government, by the political agents, and how actually you are just arguing that in your book.
I'd like to ask you a question about sovereignty sharing in the here and now. About 15 years ago, I was working with Jarosław, who had been Prime Minister of Poland, when he was President of the European Parliament. And I saw an article in the Financial Times which said that, so we're talking around 2010, which said that Poland was about 5 years away from qualifying to join the single currency. And I said to Jarosław, this is interesting, isn't it? He said, oh yes, Poland's 5 years from joining the single currency, and it always will be. And this put me onto thinking that perhaps, rather like in Britain in our relation to Europe, there were a series of hidden assumptions about the degree of sovereignty sharing which the country was prepared to accept in its membership of the European Union. So I wanted to ask you what you thought that degree of sovereignty sharing was. And in addition, for the last 20 years, Poland's been receiving a net transfer from the EU budget of around 3% of GDP a year, particularly with, perhaps because of changes in the financial circumstances of the Union or spending priorities, or because of future enlargement, that figure is surely going to decline. How far will that affect the degree of legitimacy of EU membership on the part of Poland?
Thanks very much. Thank you.
I go back.
I mentioned, I am reading for Antony Russian and European Studies here at St. Antony's. And the issue of foreign policy has been going in the discussion a lot. And we've been talking about sovereignty of Poland from a perspective of some sort of insecurity about that, and some sort of doubts that are surrounding that. But last week there was a meeting of 4 foreign ministers run by 2 online in Warsaw, and Radek Sikorski called the meeting of a big fight.
And actually, I wonder whether it's not a moment right now where we could actually talk about Poland substantially getting into that club, not only by size and by the population, by the size of the economy, but also by the actual significance and the kind of gravity within European Union. What factors play towards that, and what factors might hinder that? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you for these questions. Starting with the first one, I think that the last 8 years of Law and Justice was an example of how you could fabricate, how you could create this policy of choosing trauma. And in fact, if you remember, there was this huge scandal when Mateusz Morawiecki was chosen to be a kind of an ambassador as a historian, to supposed to propose his counter narrative. It was such a disaster because there was this incident with the New York Times journalist at the Munich Security Conference, as far as I remember, when it turned out that Mateusz Morawiecki simply failed and created an international scandal on the global scale. That was the result of his defense. So it's an interesting thing to see that the last 8 years was largely focused on reproducing a part of Polish mainstream narrative by the Law and Justice Party. I think that it should be analyzed. We had even a manual that was produced by one of professors of history. So we have a tangible result of this production. Very interesting from the research viewpoint, a horror for pupils. And I would treat it as an open question that it should be. It's only now that we should start to research it. In fact, that this trauma was used in historical politics of memory by the last government is still an ongoing process because they did not abandon. They still are supporting this viewpoint, and then it has its achievements, so to say. So I think that this is an open question, but the geopolitical situation and how it is interpreted by the new government is also interesting because it doesn't necessarily counter the previous government. Look at the migration policy. So I think it's an ongoing process. So this is something that should be even more examined. As to the second question, as to about the common currency in Poland, fully agree. That was, by the way, one of the most visible examples of limits of the post-communist myth of the West. That it was the end of imitation of the automatic, unreflective imitation of the West. When in Warsaw there was the decision was taken, okay, we are not going to enter the Eurozone. And it turned out that this was the degree of sharing sovereignty that we are asking. Here it was reached. And it's a fascinating example because, on the other hand, there was always a counter narrative, but this counter narrative was founded on the first 25 years, post 1989, that we should follow the European Union rules and regulations blindly. Mm-hmm. So that was the limit. And it's interesting to see that it started with Donald Tusk. And by the way, under his rule, another topic became fashionable, and Law and Justice made use of it. It was the trap of the middle development. That was the middle growth. Yeah, middle growth. That was the catchphrase that was so popular between 2014 2015. It was popularized by the World bank, etc. So it's interesting that was also something that was used for the sovereignty purposes. And the decline of legitimacy, absolutely. This is the subject of the debate in Poland, that the moment when we are going to be a netto payer is going to be a breakthrough, possible political breakthrough. But it's a subject of debate. It's not hidden, I believe. As to the foreign policy, the last question, the Club of Five. Well, it's a very relative, because just before there was this meeting in Berlin with Joe Biden, and Donald Tusk was not invited. So I'm very sorry to say that it's more than open question who is going to create the big five. And perhaps the most important moment will be when the talks about the peace in Ukraine are going to be open. And I don't really see that there is a place for Poland, but maybe I'm again too pessimistic.
So very briefly, just to reflect on the question about the euro and I guess the future role of Poland in the European Union. I think that this is very fascinating again, because Bulgaria is having similar debates, and we have seen how some of the pro-Russia nationalist parties have used this, that we are losing the sovereignty of the Bulgarian lev. And actually, Bulgaria has been under basically currency board for more than 2 decades. And by joining the single currencies, regaining sovereignty, because you will have a seat at the table to decide and make important decisions about the currency of the European Union and regaining sovereignty. So it's also very interesting how this is perceived usually as a one-sided exercise. I think that this question is very interesting and very important, tying in the question about the future of European integration and the future of Europe. It was, again, very interestingly, a French-German initiative that prepared a white paper discussing institutional reform of the EU. And one of the proposals was the idea of concentric circles and ultimately various levels of European integration. And the core would have included all countries who have also adopted the euro. And this caused quite a lot of frustration, and there was an immediate pushback from Poland at this point of time. And they said, oh, this was just an initial draft to start the conversation going. But the idea that we will have Hungary or Poland, Czechia excluded from the core of the EU struck quite a chord. So I think this will go hand in hand, and this very much links to the second question, which is what will happen to Poland if it's no longer contributing to the extent that it is. And this is very much about not just deepening the process of European integration, but also widening. And this will be choices that all European member states will have to make in order to let current candidate countries join the European Union. So this, I mean, it's not certain whether this will be within the remit in the next institutional cycle over the next 5 years, but this will be burning questions that need to be carefully addressed. And that's why I think it's important to have representation from Central and Eastern Europe, and politicians in Central and Eastern European countries should have important debates taking place in the national arena to discuss what are the key preferences, what is our vision, rather than, again, being excluded from this debate about the future of the European Union. And just a very quick remark about Poland's future position. I think Tusk had an immediate reaction after Donald Trump was elected, demonstrating Poland's commitment to future leadership of the European Union, particularly in the areas of security and defense. And I mean, Poland is projected to be the biggest military spender and to have one of the best or the biggest armies, I believe, in the next 5 years. So I think Poland has worked particularly prominently in this particular area, and it's very difficult to imagine European Union without Poland having to say on this very, very sensible issue. So the balance of power within the EU is also shifting. The question is to what extent it's shifting is, but definitely it is changing, and we'll have to wait and see.
Thanks very much. There's one word that's been sort of echoing through my head during this conversation, and that's a word that Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, was very keen on, podmiotowo, which is quite difficult to translate. It's often translated as subjectivity, but what it actually means is being a subject of history rather than an object of history. And we can apply that to personal life as to national. And I think, in the many meanings of sovereignty, this goes to Kate's point about what people actually feel sovereignty is. I think this sense of podmiotovos, of being a subject of history rather than an object of history, is another dimension that we might want to consider. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm sure you'll all agree. Thanks for the great questions. Above all, thanks for the great presentations and answers. Please join me. Thank you.